Science and ideology are fundamentally different things. Science, by its nature, questions assumptions. To flourish, it requires freedom of inquiry. And the free exchange of ideas. Ideology is hostile to such freedoms. Historically, when ideology has invaded science, stagnation and collapse have ensued. One of the things that's come up as a concern, particularly in the last few years, is with more and more of the postmodernist thought and DEI-related things being pushed into science in various ways, is at what point does it start impacting funding? Which is to say, I'm talking about it at length at on this channel, that many scientists at universities and the like receive grant funding from various federal agencies to do their research. And the question, of course, is what happens when there's ideological requirements made to the grant applicants such that they would have to abide by that ideology, regardless of whether or not they actually share those beliefs and that ideological leaning. There's fundamental problems with that, and that's come up recently in a new paper. I will say it's a preprint. It hasn't been published yet, but it's my understanding it's tentatively accepted for publication. So when I look at the particular things, I'll pull that up in a second. I think, in fact, hold on. I just wanted to have that handy before I continued. Here, that particular link. But this came up in the Heterodox STEM Substack, where it was summarized in brief. Politicizing science funding undermines public trust in science, academic freedom, and the unbiased generation of knowledge. So you're talking about an international group of researchers talking about their particular experiences here, but also that they have collected some examples. And this is actually, whoops, I'm in the wrong, here we go. There we go. This is actually where it is going to eventually be published. Oh, in fact, matter is entirely here now. Wow, okay. When I first came across this in the Heterodox STEM thing, it hadn't been published yet, so I will continue with the preprint, but I encourage you, of course, to go check out the full article, because it is in full here now, because it was not before. It had been accepted, but it had not been published just yet. So FYI, it's here, and I will provide a link for you, but I have the preprint handy, as you can tell, so I'm going to actually look at it, talk about it a little bit, and hit some of the highlights. This will hopefully not be a long video, but I do want to highlight some of the important things in here that the authors raise as concerns with regards to the ideological insertion of DEI with regards to federal funding of grants for research in STEM disciplines, but also just in general, the ideological requirements, period, and why they don't belong. So let us get into it. Politicizing science funding undermines public trust in science, academic freedom, and the unbiased generation of knowledge. The abstract here. This commentary documents how federal funding agencies are changing the criteria by which they distribute taxpayer money intended for scientific research. Increasingly STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, funding agencies are requiring applicants for funding to include a plan to advance DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, in the proposals, and to dedicate part of the research budget to its implementation. These mandates undermine the academic freedom of researchers and the unbiased generation of knowledge needed for a well-functioning democracy. Maintaining excellence in science is fundamental to the continuation of the U.S. as a global economic leader. Science provides a basis for solving important global challenges such as security, energy, climate, and health. Diverting funding from science into activities unrelated to the production of knowledge undermines science's ability to serve humankind. When funding agencies politicize science by using their power to further a particular ideological agenda, they contribute to public mistrust in science. Hijacking science funding to promote DEI is thus a threat to our society. Okay, so this actually, I didn't read this earlier. I was just reading it really quickly here. That's why I paused. This is actually from Thomas Sowell's most recent book, Social Justice Fallacies. quote, do we want the mixture of students who are going to be trained to do advanced medical research to be representative of the demographic makeup of the population as a whole? Or do we want whatever students from whatever backgrounds who have track records demonstrating a mastery of the medical science that gives the highest probability of finding cures for cancer, Alzheimer's, and other devastating diseases? Endeavors have purposes. Is indulging ideological visions more important than ending cancer and Alzheimer's? Love Thomas Sowell for just that quote. So, briefly from the introduction. Science is essential for humankind to thrive. Science is the foundation of technologies that deliver food and energy and medicine. Scientific progress has contributed to the greatly improved human condition worldwide, including higher standards of living, lengthened lifespans, and the eradication of deadly diseases and famine. Science was the key ingredient of the Industrial Revolution, which propelled Western democracies to economic prosperity. Maintaining strong basic science research and education is essential for a country's security and technological competitiveness. The U.S. and other developed countries have long recognized the need for sustained support of the STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine fields. And this is true because you notice there's many billions of dollars that's actually put towards funding of scientific research. And that's actually what's in this table is, for example, the National Science Foundation, $10.2 billion, the National Institutes of Health, the Department of Energy, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. They're focusing on these because they do some of the most fundamental related research funding. U.S. funding agencies have excellent track records, as evidenced by the immense success that American science has enjoyed. Recently, however, the function of these essential institutions has been undergoing significant changes. There has been a broad effort to use science funding to further the diversity, equity, inclusion agenda. While the terms diversity, equity, inclusion connote lofty goals with which the majority of Americans agree, a close look at what is actually implemented under the DEI umbrella reveals that these words represent something entirely different. Actual DEI policies do not promote viewpoint diversity, equitable treatment of individuals based on their accomplishment, or equal opportunity for individuals regardless of their identity. It can scarcely be questioned that DEI programs today are driven by an ideology, an offshoot of critical social justice. Postmodernist thought is a lot in here. So, they detail up at the front here some of the statements made by the agencies themselves that don't necessarily have any basis to them, but are sort of made ad nauseum in support of something. And in the commentary, they're getting into, how agencies have begun to impose certain requirements on individuals. Now, the reason I'm not going too much into the details here is because it's not just a problem when you have something like DEI as an ideological requirement. It's a problem when you have an ideological requirement being pushed onto scientists via funding, period, is the bigger thing that I am far more worried about. This just provides a handy vehicle to talk about the issue. And admittedly, I am concerned about that for the long term here when you're talking about these particular future of science, and they get into that. Historically, U.S. funding agencies have sought to allocate funds based on the intellectual merit of the proposed ideas, the soundness of the technical plan, the feasibility of the requested budget, and the alignment of the proposed research with the agency's mission, and the principal investigators' track records. This merit-based approach, however, is now being de-emphasized. Funding agencies are introducing additional requirements not related to the proposed science, such as the mandated DEI statements and plans and requirements to formulate research projects through a lens sympathetic to DEI ideology. These requirements are often vague, and related review criteria are opaque. For example, the Department of Energy has introduced a requirement that every research proposal include a peer plan, which is promoting inclusive and equitable research, which, quote, should describe the activities and strategies that investigators and research personnel will incorporate to promote diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in their research projects. The peer plans will be evaluated as part of the research process. Things like that, and again, I'm not going to detail it too much in here because this is not necessarily about the specific thing per se, although I am concerned about that. It's more so, should you really have ideological requirements for grant funding at all? I'm going to go down here a little bit more. Because here's the thing, and it's not just, like I said, it's not just just about DEI statements, though it is a problem, and you all know what I think the DEI statements are: ideological litmus tests and compelled speech, and we'll get into that more so here in a moment. DEI statements are compelled speech. Paraphrasing Thomas Sowell, 2023, spiritual leaders encourage, funding agencies compel. As amply documented in the context of hiring, it is not sufficient for the applicant to make a thoughtful, reasonable statement about non-discrimination in line with applicable law. Rather, the statement must fully align with DEI ideology. For example, applicants' DEI statements professing a doctrine of colorblindness have been systematically given the lowest score. Similar rubrics are used by universities participating in the NIH program Faculty Institutional Recruitment for Sustainable Transformation, which provides support to new faculty hires. The guidelines these agencies provide to PIs and funded proposals shared with us suggest that DEI plans must fully align with DEI ideology in order to have any hope of success. For example, according to one group's guidelines, the assessment of the inclusion plan will be based on the extent to which the inclusion plan demonstrated awareness of systemic barriers to creating inclusive working environments and that are specific to the proposal team. Emphasis theirs. However, not all observed disparities are due to systemic discrimination or biases. If an applicant's institution has already overcome any systemic barriers it may have had, or the applicant believes it has done so, then the applicant must lie or the proposal is doomed to fail. The requirement to write an inclusion plan implies that remedial action is needed. But if access to an applicant's research team is already fair and non-discriminatory, why should an applicant be required to write an inclusion plan, a plan that requires awareness of systemic barriers specific to the proposal team, in order to succeed? The demand to provide inclusion evidence without evidence that there is need for one is compelled speech and intrusion of ideology into the conduct of science. I'm going to highlight that real quick so I have that for later. But this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. When ideological requirements come into play at all, forgo for a moment that this is DEI we're talking about. Although, again, like I said, if you've been around on this channel long enough, you know I'm no fan. You shouldn't have the ideological requirements at all, particularly because it's not related to the merit of the work most of the time. Let's see. Based on feedback the authors have received from federal agencies, uncritical adoption of the doctrine is required, even if entirely unrelated or even detrimental to the proposed project. Scientists cannot propose plans to help overcome what they observe to be real barriers to success in the field, but they are compelled to conform. This is the compulsion to an ideological agenda. Forget exactly what agenda it is. Does not help anyone do science. Let's see. There is also the legal consideration specific to DEI, but it would be specific to any other kinds of legal stuff here, in that the interaction of DEI with the legal system is troubling. First, the demands that PIs acknowledge systemic racism and barriers to participation in their institution and insert land acknowledgments in their scientific publications raise grave legal concerns. The First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States strictly forbids compelling people to say things they do not believe are true. The circumstances under which the government may grant benefits or may condition grants or benefits, on attesting that one holds a certain belief, e.g. acknowledges the truth to be this with respect to that contested matter, though somewhat obscure, are certainly limited. At a minimum, governments engaging in such conditioning on contested questions raises significant civil liberties concerns and is in tension with core First Amendment values. Second, there are strict laws against discrimination already and can be prosecuted under that. Third, even more worrying, is that successful applications require principal investigators and their home institutions to engage in practices that are likely illegal. For example, DEI equity-based plans for equal gender or racial participation can, in practice, only be implemented by engaging in preferential hiring. This is strictly illegal under civil rights employment law. Now, they go on here to actually comment on on initiatives that were but have been rescinded. And then the authors here insert a comment from Professor Kevin Williams of Temple University, related to the National Institutes of Health specifically. The NIH continues to emphasize that diversity of teams is an asset in funding decisions. This creates a moral dilemma for scientists of diverse ancestry, as explained by Professor Kevin Williams of Temple University. Do I deserve to jump the line? If I say yes, I may be quote, by the way, play a leading role in ending the scourge of atherosclerosis, known as the hardening of the arteries. If I play fair, I may lose the opportunity to save people around the world from heart attacks and strokes. I'm angry at the National Institutes of Health for putting me in this position. I'm even angrier it has done so in the name of racial equity. If I refuse to identify myself as African American, our application is more likely to lose on diversity grounds. It's a double wrong. Not only is the system rigged based on non-scientific and possibly illegal criteria, it encourages me to join in the rigging. Truth be told, I made my decision years ago. When my study files our application, it won't note my origins. If we don't get the grant, so be it. I refuse to engage in a moral wrong in pursuit of a moral good. And there you go. With that, I won't go any further with that, as you can read the rest of it yourself. Of course, it's already publicly available. That is one thing I have noted also. Such plans are not open to public scrutiny necessarily. This has been talked about ad nauseum, so I won't add to it more, in that when you start engaging in ideological stuff with science, particularly with respect to DEI politicization in here, good damn fly, excuse me, then you do run into the other problem of, well, you're going to be losing trust. And this has been talked about elsewhere. I know I've talked about it elsewhere, that there are some surveys and studies that suggest that now, that there's a loss of trust here. And that is actually, there's one highlighted here that is of relevant nature here. There's the administrative overload thing, of course. There's all of these other this is actually a good section. It's very long, which is why I'm not going to read it right now. But the why is this happening goes into the executive orders that resulted in the creation of such things. This is an important thing to note in here, because it is not clear how science is supposed to benefit from the imposition of DEI ideology and programs on funding decisions. To our knowledge, there have been no quantitative studies demonstrating that any DEI intervention has increased the quality or quantity of scientific output. This is a true statement. To my knowledge, there has been no such research to that effect. Now, that could very well be because it's still actually quite new in STEM, so Lord only knows, it might take a little while before you actually find anything, but I don't know that it's necessarily a good thing in here. But the other point here that they make at the very end is that when you take it to its extreme conclusion, with the ideological control of something, that's where you end up with Lysenkoism, where people who disagree are shunted out, and in times in very, very dark and bad ways. And that would happen in Trofim Lysenko's day. Is a lot of scientists were killed or imprisoned if they didn't follow along with what Lysenko believed at the time, which ended up being very, very flawed and ultimately caused a huge amount of famine. Devastating famines in both the Soviet Union and when Mao Zedong adopted his practices in China also. So this is the problem. This is why ideological control of science, right, left, it doesn't matter what the ideological thing even is, but ideological control of science is a hugely bad thing. Don't need any of this stuff in science, to be honest. Science is a national and indeed global public good that has afforded an unprecedented standard of living and well-being, the eradication of diseases, healthier lives, and increased lifespans. Although the benefits have not been shared equally, scientific progress has benefited all members of society. True statement. Science and ideology are fundamentally different things. Science, by its nature, questions assumptions. To flourish, it requires freedom of inquiry and the free exchange of ideas. Ideology is hostile to such freedoms. Historically, when ideology has invaded science, stagnation and collapse have ensued. In order to be effective in advancing knowledge, delivering information, and serving humankind, science must 1. Operate free from ideology and politicization in a climate of open inquiry. 2. Center the autonomy of researchers, acknowledging their expert role and allowing them to do what they do best, and minimizing time spent on administrative compliance and reporting duties and so-called broader impact activities. Oh, goodness. So they go on here to the very end with these, in juxtaposing the words of Chief Justice Don Roberts in the SCOTUS decision ending affirmative action versus the words of Ibram Kendi. And just basically to go on to say that, hey, the scientific agencies shouldn't be doing this at all. And to the larger point, I actually very much agree. Scientific agencies should not, flatly not, ever be making funding decisions with ideological leanings involved. Now, there's a difference in there in deciding what kind of questions exactly are of interest. That's a different thing. But they shouldn't be forcing researchers to have ideological compliance with certain things in order to get funding. That is compulsion, and I do think it actually is a direct violation of the First Amendment. Though, to my knowledge, this is the thing, to my knowledge, there's not been the explicit case brought yet to make that legal precedent happen. And that was one thing I would note with that. I want to see it, to be honest, because I want to see the question get settled. But that hasn't happened just yet. But it needs to. Anyway, I thought I would bring you a very short summary of this particular article. I will link it, since it's now actually available on the journal's website. But I will also link it and the Heterodox STEM article in the description of the video for you. I encourage you to go read it. Go read it. Tell me your thoughts after you've read it, and all those kinds of things. Until next time, I hope you stay curious.